Margaret Sullivan had been a widow for 8 months when the harassment began. Her husband, a Marine who died saving 3 men from a burning Humvee in Kandahar, left her with memories, medals, and a modest rental house in rural Montana. She thought she'd grieve in peace. She was wrong. The landlord, Dale Pritchard, started showing up unannounced. First it was inspections, then it was late-night knocks, then it was threats about eviction if she didn't cooperate. Margaret was 62, alone and terrified. She had no family left, no one to call. The police told her it was a civil matter. What Pritchard didn't know was that Margaret's husband had a brother, not by blood, by war. A man named Jacob Reaper Stone, who rode with the Iron Covenant MC, a brotherhood of veterans who'd made a promise to each other in the deserts of Iraq. No brother left behind, no family abandoned. When Margaret finally found the courage to call the number her husband left in a sealed envelope marked, "If you ever need help," she didn't expect anything. She'd given up on hope. Jacob answered on the second ring. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, there was only silence. Then 3 words that would change everything. "We're coming, ma'am." 27 hours later, at 6:43 on a Saturday morning, the sound of 80 Harley-Davidsons rolled down the gravel road to Margaret's house like thunder across a forgotten plain. Dale Pritchard was about to learn that some debts are paid in iron, loyalty, and the unbreakable code of men who refuse to let the innocent suffer alone. The knock came at 11:47 p.m., sharp and deliberate, like a judge's gavel against wood. Each rap echoed through the small house with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, someone who understood that timing was everything when it came to intimidation. Margaret Sullivan froze in her kitchen, the delicate porcelain teacup halfway to her lips, steam still rising from the chamomile tea she'd hoped would help her sleep. The house was silent, except for the persistent hum of the ancient refrigerator and the distant bark of the Johnson's German Shepherd 3 houses down. She set the cup down slowly on the worn wooden table, her hands trembling like autumn leaves in a Montana wind. She knew who it was. She'd known for the past 3 weeks, ever since the visits had started becoming more frequent, more invasive, more threatening. If you're watching this, please leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. It helps us keep bringing you these stories. Dale Pritchard had been coming around for weeks now, always late, always alone, always with that smile that made her skin crawl like insects were walking across her grave. He owned the property, a small 2-bedroom rental on the outskirts of Billings, Montana, nestled between rolling hills and endless sky, where Margaret had lived for the past 3 years with her husband, Tom. Tom was gone now. 8 months in the ground at Arlington National Cemetery, buried with full military honors after an improvised explosive device had torn through his Humvee on a dusty road outside Kandahar. The blast had killed him instantly, along with 2 other Marines, but not before Tom had managed to pull 3 wounded soldiers from the wreckage, saving their lives with his last conscious act. Margaret had his flag, carefully folded in the regulation triangle and handed to her by a young officer whose voice cracked when he said the words, "On behalf of a grateful nation." She had his Purple Heart, his Bronze Star, and a photograph on the mantel showing Tom in his dress blues, young and proud and alive. That was all she had left of 34 years of marriage. The knock came again, harder this time, more insistent. The sound reverberated through the house like a gunshot, and Margaret felt her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird, desperate to escape. Margaret walked to the front door with deliberate slowness, her bare feet silent on the cold hardwood floor. She could see Pritchard's silhouette through the frosted glass, tall, broad-shouldered, mid-40s, with a beer gut that strained against his flannel shirt and a swagger that screamed entitlement and barely controlled aggression. "Mrs. Sullivan," he called out. his voice muffled but cheerful in that way that predators often sound when they're closing in on their prey. "Just doing a routine check. Need to make sure everything's up to code. You know how it is with these old rentals." "It's almost midnight, Mr. Pritchard," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her chest like a serpent ready to strike. "You can come back tomorrow during normal business hours." "Won't take but a minute," he said, jiggling the doorknob with increasing aggression. The brass handle rattled against the wooden frame like bones in a coffin. "Come on now. Don't make this difficult. We're both adults here." Margaret backed away from the door, her pulse hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears. This was the fourth time this week he'd shown up unannounced. Each visit, he'd gotten bolder, more invasive, more threatening. Last time, he'd brushed past her into the living room without invitation, his eyes scanning the space like a predator marking territory. He'd commented on how lonely it must be for a woman her age, how quiet the house was at night, how he could keep her company if she needed it. The way he'd said it made her stomach turn. She'd asked him to leave, her voice firm but polite. He'd smiled that cold, calculating smile and said, "You're a month behind on rent, Margaret. I'm being generous here. Don't test my patience." But she wasn't behind. She'd paid on time every single month, just like Tom had taught her. When she'd checked her bank records the next morning, the electronic deposits were all there, clear evidence of payment. Yet Pritchard kept insisting she owed him money, kept creating emergencies that required his immediate attention, kept finding reasons to invade her space and her peace. Tonight, she didn't open the door. She stood in her living room, surrounded by memories of Tom, and refused to let this man take away the last sanctuary she had left. After 5 long minutes that felt like hours, the knocking stopped. She heard his boots crunch on the gravel driveway, each step deliberate and angry. A truck door slammed with excessive force, the sound cutting through the night air like a threat. The engine roared to life, and headlights swept across the living room wall as he backed out of her driveway and disappeared into the darkness. Margaret sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands, and finally allowed herself to cry. She couldn't do this anymore. She was drowning, and there was no one left to throw her a lifeline. The next morning dawned grey and cold, with the kind of Montana winter that settled into your bones and stayed there until spring decided to show mercy. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, wrapped in Tom's old Marine Corps sweatshirt that still smelled faintly of his cologne, staring at the sealed envelope she'd found in Tom's desk drawer 2 weeks after the funeral. The desk was a massive oak piece that Tom had inherited from his father, scarred and weathered from decades of use. Margaret had avoided going through it for months after his death, unable to face the personal items, the unfinished business, the remnants of a life cut short. But eventually, necessity had forced her hand when she needed to find important documents for the insurance claims and military benefits. The envelope was plain white, slightly worn around the edges, with her name written in Tom's distinctive blocky handwriting across the front. "Margaret, open only if you need help." The paper was slightly yellowed, suggesting it had been there for some time, waiting patiently for a crisis that Tom had somehow anticipated. She'd kept it in a shoebox under her bed, unopened, because opening it felt like admitting Tom was really gone forever, like admitting she couldn't handle things on her own, couldn't be the strong, independent woman he'd always believed her to be. Opening that envelope meant acknowledging that she was truly alone in the world, with no one left to protect her from predators like Dale Pritchard. But last night had broken something inside her, some final barrier between dignity and desperation. With shaking hands that trembled like aspen leaves in a high wind, she tore open the envelope with deliberate care, not wanting to damage whatever message Tom had left for her. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded neatly, and a phone number written in black ink in Tom's careful script. The note read, "Maggie, if you're reading this, something's gone wrong and I'm not there to fix it. I'm sorry for that. More sorry than you'll ever know. I always promised I'd protect you, and I'm breaking that promise by not being there when you need me most. But you're not alone. You never were, and you never will be. Call this number. His name is Jacob Stone. We served together in Fallujah, Iraq. He's my brother in every way that matters except blood. I saved his life once. He saved mine twice. That makes him family. Tell him you're my family. Tell him Tom Sullivan sent you. He'll come. They all will. It's a promise we made to each other in the desert, and it's a promise that doesn't die when we do. Don't be afraid to ask for help. That's what family does. We carry each other when the load gets too heavy. I love you more than all the stars in the Montana sky. Margaret stared at the number for a long time, her vision blurred with tears she'd been holding back for months. She'd never heard Tom mention a Jacob Stone, though that wasn't surprising. Tom didn't talk much about the war when he came home. He'd left as a young man full of dreams and returned as someone older, quieter, carrying shadows in his eyes that she never fully understood, but always respected. He'd been different after Iraq, still kind, still loving, still the man she'd married, but marked by experiences he couldn't share and didn't want to burden her with. She picked up her phone with trembling fingers and dialed the number before she could talk herself out of it, before doubt and pride could convince her to handle this alone. It rang 3 times, each tone stretching into eternity. Then a deep, gravelly voice answered, rough around the edges like sandpaper on wood. "This is Reaper." Margaret's throat tightened with emotion. My name is Margaret Sullivan. My husband was Tom Sullivan. He served in Iraq, and he told me to call this number if I ever needed help." There was a pause that lasted forever, filled with the weight of recognition and memory. Then the voice softened, just slightly, like steel wrapped in velvet. "Tom's gone, isn't he?" "Yes," she whispered, the word catching in her throat like a fishhook. 8 months now, Kandahar. "I'm sorry, Ma'am. He was one of the best men I ever knew, one of the best men who ever lived." Another pause, heavy with respect and grief. "What's wrong? What do you need?" And so Margaret told him everything, about Pritchard and his escalating harassment, about the late-night visits that made her afraid to sleep, about the threats disguised as concern, about how the police had dismissed her complaints as a civil matter, and how the one lawyer she'd consulted wanted a retainer she couldn't afford on her fixed income. When she finished, there was only silence on the line, so complete she wondered if the call had dropped. Then Jacob Reaper Stone said 3 words that made her cry for the first time in months, not from sadness, but from relief. "We're coming, ma'am." Jacob Stone stood in the garage of his ranch outside Missoula, Montana, surrounded by the organized chaos of a working man's domain. Tools hung in precise order on pegboard walls, motorcycle parts were sorted in labeled boxes, and the concrete floor bore the permanent stains of oil and grease from decades of mechanical work. The space smelled of motor oil, leather, and the faint trace of burning sage from the hills outside. He was staring at a photograph pinned to the corkboard above his workbench, surrounded by deployment schedules, motorcycle rally flyers, and telephone numbers of brothers scattered across the western states. The photograph was from Fallujah, 2006, taken during a brief moment of peace in the middle of hell. 19 men in desert camouflage uniforms, covered in dust and sweat and the indefinable patina of war, grinning at the camera like they owned the world and nothing could touch them. They were young and invincible, and completely unaware that half of them wouldn't make it home. Tom Sullivan stood in the back row, right next to Jacob, his arm slung over Jacob's shoulder in the casual way of brothers. Tom was smiling that easy grin that could light up a room. The same smile Jacob imagined he'd given Margaret every morning for 34 years. They'd lost 6 men from that photograph over the course of their deployment. Roadside bombs, sniper fire, mortar attacks, and the 1,000 other ways war found to steal young lives. Tom Sullivan was the seventh to die, though his death had come years later on a different battlefield, in a different war, still wearing the uniform and still saving lives until the very end. We're coming to you live from rural Montana, where loyalty runs deeper than blood. Drop a comment if you believe in standing up for those who can't stand alone. Jacob pulled his phone from his pocket and opened the group chat labeled Iron Covenant, Brothers Only, a secure messaging app that connected veterans from a dozen motorcycle chapters across the Mountain West. He typed, "Tom Sullivan's widow is in trouble. Landlord's been harassing her, threats, late-night visits, making her afraid in her own home. Police won't help. Lawyers want money she doesn't have. She's alone and scared. Tom died in Kandahar saving other Marines. He was one of us. She's family. We ride at dawn. Billings, Montana. Full colors. No excuses. Spread the word." The responses came within seconds, lighting up his phone screen like a Christmas tree. "Priest, Jesus Christ, I'm in. On my way from Kalispell. ETA 0600. Hammer, motherfuckers. Nobody messes with our family. Rolling out now. Doc, mobilizing the Bozeman chapter. We'll have 30 bikes. Full medical kit just in case. Gunner, pulling the boys from Spokane. Another 20 confirmed. This piece of shit picked the wrong widow. Phoenix. Wyoming chapter rolling, 15 bikes. We ride for Tom. Steel, Great Falls chapter confirmed. 12 riders, full colors. Ranger, Flathead chapter, 8 confirmed. This is what we do. By midnight, Jacob had confirmations from 8 chapters across Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. The digital brotherhood had activated with the efficiency of a military operation, because that's exactly what it was. A military operation conducted by men who'd never really left the battlefield, who'd simply brought their brotherhood home and adapted it to civilian life. 80 riders, all veterans, all brothers, all bound by the same code they'd sworn to in the deserts of Iraq and the mountains of Afghanistan. No brother left behind, no family abandoned, no matter what. Jacob walked outside into the crisp Montana air and looked up at the stars. The same stars Tom and Margaret had looked at together for 34 years, the same stars that had shone over their foxholes in Fallujah. By dawn, Dale Pritchard would learn that some women have families you don't see coming until it's too late. Families bound not by blood, but by something stronger. Honor, loyalty, and the unbreakable bonds forged in fire and sacrifice. The Iron Covenant was riding to war. They rolled into Billings at exactly 6:43 a.m. on a Saturday morning, just as the first rays of sunlight broke over the Yellowstone River and painted the eastern sky in shades of gold and crimson. The timing was deliberate, early enough to catch Pritchard off guard, late enough for the neighbors to witness everything that was about to unfold. 80 Harley-Davidson motorcycles moved in tight formation down Highway 2, their engines creating a synchronized roar that rattled windows 3 miles away and turned every head in the city. The sound was unmistakable, not the casual rumble of weekend riders, but the purposeful thunder of men on a mission. Chrome gleamed in the early morning light like polished armor, and black leather reflected the sunrise like the wings of avenging angels. At the front of the formation rode Jacob Reaper Stone on his 2018 Road King, the bike's massive engine rumbling with the deep, authoritative note of perfectly tuned machinery. His leather vest bore the patch of the Iron Covenant MC, a steel shield crossed with cavalry sabers, surrounded by the words, "No brother left behind," stitched in silver thread across the top, and brothers by choice, warriors by nature across the bottom. Behind him rode Priest, a former army chaplain whose real name was Michael Torres. The scar across his throat was a permanent reminder of the day an insurgent's knife had nearly ended his life in a Ramadi back alley. He'd survived, found God again, and now served as the spiritual anchor for men who'd seen too much darkness to believe in easy salvation. Next came Hammer, Thomas Tom Mitchell, not to be confused with their fallen brother. He was an ex-Marine sniper who'd lost his left eye to shrapnel in Helmand Province, but could still outshoot most men with his remaining eye. His bike was a custom Softail with the military-grade communication system built into the handlebars. Then Doc, Dr. James Patterson, a former combat medic who'd transitioned to civilian medicine but still carried the trauma kit that had saved dozens of lives in 3 different war zones. His bike's saddlebags contained enough medical supplies to run a field hospital, because in his world, being prepared for the worst wasn't paranoia, it was survival, and 76 more just like them, each with their own story of service, sacrifice, and survival. They were construction workers and teachers, mechanics and business owners, fathers and grandfathers who'd traded military uniforms for leather vests, but never abandoned the brotherhood that had kept them alive in the world's most dangerous places. They pulled onto Margaret Street in a slow, deliberate procession that took 7 full minutes to complete. The formation was military precise, bikes lined up on both sides of the narrow residential road with mathematical accuracy, creating a corridor of chrome and steel that stretched for 3 city blocks. Neighbors stepped onto porches in bathrobes and pajamas, eyes wide with shock and curiosity. A few pulled out phones to record what was unfolding, but most simply stood and watched in awed silence. Children pressed their faces against bedroom windows. Dogs stopped barking. Even the morning birds seemed to pause their songs to witness the arrival of the Iron Covenant. Jacob killed his engine and dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who'd been riding motorcycles for 30 years. He was tall and lean, built like a coiled spring, with a shaved head that revealed a spider web of scars from an IED blast in Tikrit. His arms were covered in tattoos, military unit insignia, coordinates of fallen friends, and a portrait of a German shepherd named Rex, who'd saved his unit from a suicide bomber and died in the process. He walked up the gravel driveway to the small house where Margaret stood on the porch, clutching a faded cardigan around her shoulders. She looked smaller than he'd imagined, more fragile, but her eyes were steady and clear. This was a woman who'd buried her husband with dignity and faced months of harassment without breaking. This was a Marine's wife, and Jacob could see the steel in her spine. "Mrs. Sullivan," Jacob said, pulling off his sunglasses to reveal eyes the color of winter sky. "I'm Jacob Stone. Tom and I served together in Fallujah. He saved my life more than once." Margaret's lips trembled, but her voice was steady. "You didn't have to come. I never expected this many." "Yes, ma'am, we did." Jacob glanced back at the sea of bikers filling the street like an occupying army. "Tom was family. That makes you family, and the Iron Covenant doesn't let family get pushed around by bullies and predators." Margaret looked past him at the men, scarred, weathered, dangerous-looking warriors who'd seen combat in a dozen different countries, and felt something inside her chest loosen for the first time in months. For the first time since Tom's death, she didn't feel alone. "What do we do now?" she asked. Jacob smiled, and it wasn't kind. It was the smile of a man who'd faced down insurgents in Fallujah and lived to tell about it. "Now we wait for your landlord to show up, and when he does, we're going to have a very educational conversation." No, Dale Pritchard was halfway through his morning coffee and scrolling through his phone when the device buzzed with a text message from his neighbor, Linda Kowalski, who lived 2 streets over and had a notorious reputation for neighborhood gossip. "Dale, you need to see what's happening at the Sullivan place, right now." Attached was a photograph that made Pritchard's coffee cup freeze halfway to his lips. Margaret's entire street, packed wall to wall with motorcycles and men in leather vests, arranged in military formation like some kind of biker army. Pritchard frowned. set down his favorite mug, a ceramic piece emblazoned with "World's Greatest Landlord" that his ex-wife had given him sarcastically during their divorce proceedings, and grabbed his truck keys from the kitchen counter. His mind raced with possibilities. Was this some kind of biker rally? A veterans event? Did the old woman somehow know these people? 25 minutes later, he pulled his red Ford F-150 onto the street and stopped cold, his breath catching in his throat like he'd been punched in the solar plexus. Holy shit! Holy fucking shit! There had to be 70, maybe 80 bikers standing in perfect formation along both sides of the road, arms crossed over their chests, silent as grave markers in Arlington Cemetery. They didn't move when his truck appeared. Didn't speak or gesture or show any sign of acknowledgement. They just watched with the patient, predatory stillness of wolves studying prey. The bikes were pristine, not the flashy chrome of weekend warriors, but the purposeful, well-maintained machines of serious riders. Many bore military insignia, unit patches, and memorial stickers. These weren't suburban rebels playing dress-up. These were the real deal. Pritchard drove slowly through the gauntlet, trying to keep his hands steady on the steering wheel. His palms were sweating, and his heart was hammering against his ribs like a jackhammer on concrete. Every instinct he possessed was screaming at him to turn around, to drive away, to pretend he'd never seen this display of organized intimidation. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. He was Dale Pritchard, successful businessman, property owner, pillar of the community. He wouldn't be intimidated by a bunch of leather-wearing thugs, no matter how many of them there were. He parked in Margaret's driveway with exaggerated casualness, trying to project an air of confidence he didn't feel. His mind raced through possible explanations and exit strategies, but every scenario ended with him looking weak in front of an audience he couldn't afford to show weakness to. He stepped out of the truck, forcing his most disarming smile, the same one he used with nervous tenants and skeptical city inspectors. "Morning, folks. Didn't realize we were having some kind of party. Nobody invited me to the neighborhood barbecue." No one responded. The silence was deafening, oppressive, like the moment before thunder breaks. Then a man stepped forward from the crowd, tall, broad-shouldered, mid-40s with a shaved head and a scar running from his left temple to his jaw like a lightning bolt frozen in flesh. He wore a leather vest with patches Pritchard didn't recognize, and he moved with the fluid confidence of someone who'd been in more fights than he'd lost. The man's eyes were the pale blue of Arctic ice, and when they fixed on Pritchard, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You Dale Pritchard?" the man asked, his voice carrying the flat, emotionless tone of someone who'd interrogated prisoners in places the Geneva Convention didn't reach. "That's me," Pritchard said, puffing his chest slightly and trying to reclaim some authority. "And who the hell are you? What's all this about?" "Jacob Stone. Friends call me Reaper." He stopped 3 feet away, close enough that Pritchard could smell leather and motor oil and something else, something that reminded him of cordite and distant violence. "I'm here about Margaret Sullivan." Pritchard glanced toward the house, where Margaret stood on the porch in her cardigan, watching the confrontation with an expression he couldn't read. His confident smile faltered slightly. "Look, I don't know what she told you, but this is between me and my tenant. It's private business, and frankly, it's none of your concern." It stopped being private when you started showing up at her door after midnight," Jacob said, his voice never rising above conversational level, but somehow carrying more menace than a shouted threat. Pritchard's jaw tightened, and he felt the first stirrings of genuine anger mixing with his fear. "I'm her landlord. I have every legal right to inspect my property and ensure my tenant is complying with the terms of her lease." "You have no rights here," Jacob interrupted, his words cutting through Pritchard's bluster like a knife through paper. "Not anymore." Behind him, The wall of bikers shifted slightly, not moving forward, but settling into ready positions like soldiers preparing for combat. The movement was subtle but unmistakable, and Pritchard felt his bladder clench with involuntary terror. Pritchard swallowed hard, tasting copper and fear. "Are you threatening me? Because if you are, I'll call the police. I'll have every one of you arrested for harassment and intimidation." Jacob smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only the cold satisfaction of a predator who'd cornered something weak and pathetic. "No, sir, I'm not threatening you. I'm educating you. There's a difference, and you're about to learn what it is." Jacob took a deliberate step closer to Pritchard, and the landlord instinctively stepped back, his shoulder blades pressing against the warm metal of his truck. The morning sun was climbing higher now, casting long shadows across the street and highlighting every scar, every tattoo, every hard line on the faces of the men surrounding him. "Here's what's going to happen," Jacob said, his voice low and measured like a judge reading a death sentence. "You're going to leave Mrs. Sullivan alone, permanently. No more late-night visits. No more surprise inspections. No more harassment disguised as landlord duties. No more bullshit about rent she's already paid. Your reign of terror ends today." "I don't know what she told you, but—" Pritchard began. But Jacob held up a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence with a gesture that carried absolute authority. "I'm not done," Jacob said. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, handing it to Pritchard with the formality of a court officer serving a subpoena. "That's a notarized statement from Mrs. Sullivan's bank, confirming she's paid every cent she owes, on time, every month for 3 years. Your little extortion scam is over." Pritchard unfolded the paper with shaking hands, his eyes scanning the official bank letterhead and the detailed payment history that proved Margaret's innocence beyond any doubt. His face went red, then pale, then red again as the implications sank in. "You can't just—" he started. "I can, and I am." Jacob's eyes hardened like steel cooling in winter air. "You're also going to return her security deposit. All of it. Every penny you've been holding illegally, and you're going to sign over her lease, free and clear, effective immediately. Consider it a donation to the widow of a man who died serving his country, something you wouldn't understand because you've never served anything except your own selfish interests." "This is extortion," Pritchard sputtered, spittle flying from his lips as his composure finally cracked. "This is illegal intimidation. I'll have you all arrested." "No," Jacob said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Extortion is what you've been doing to Mrs. Sullivan. Intimidation is what you've been putting her through. This is justice." Behind him, one of the bikers, a massive man with a greying beard and shoulders like a linebacker, cracked his knuckles with a sound like breaking bones. His vest bore the nickname Hammer, and the scars on his hands suggested he'd earned it the hard way. "You see," Jacob continued, "Mrs. Sullivan called me because her husband asked her to. Tom Sullivan, Marine Corps, died in Kandahar saving other Marines from a burning vehicle. He was my brother, not by blood, but by something stronger. We made a promise to each other in the Iraqi desert. No brother left behind, no family abandoned. Tom kept that promise until the day he died. Now it's our turn to keep it for him." Pritchard looked around wildly, panic creeping into his eyes like water filling a sinking ship. There were too many of them. They were too organized, too calm, too professional. These weren't random bikers looking for trouble. They were veterans, trained soldiers who'd fought in real wars and survived. And they weren't bluffing. "Fine!" he spat, his voice cracking with humiliation and rage. "Fine! I'll leave her alone. Just get these people away from my property." "It's not your property anymore," Jacob said. "It's hers. And we're not people. We're United States military veterans, and you'll show some fucking respect when you talk about us." One of the other bikers stepped forward, this one lean and weathered, with silver hair and eyes like gunmetal. His vest identified him as Doc, and when he spoke, his voice carried the calm authority of someone who'd given orders under fire. "Mr. Pritchard," Doc said, "I want you to understand something very clearly. We know where you live. We know where you work. We know every property you own, every business deal you've made, every corner you've cut, and every law you've bent. We've done our research, and we're very thorough." Pritchard's face went white as fresh snow. "If you ever, and I mean ever, come near Mrs. Sullivan again, if you ever even think about her, if you ever so much as drive down this street again, we'll know about it within an hour," Doc continued. "And next time there won't be a conversation. There won't be warnings or explanations or opportunities to do the right thing. There will just be consequences. Do you understand me?" Pritchard nodded frantically, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. Yes, I understand." "Good," Jacob said. "Now get in your truck and drive away. And remember, we're watching. We're always watching." Pritchard climbed back into his truck with shaking hands, fumbled with the keys, and peeled out of the driveway so fast his tires left rubber marks on the asphalt. The sound of his engine faded into the distance like a retreating enemy, leaving only the rumble of 80 Harley-Davidsons and the whisper of Montana wind through the trees. The bikers watched him go, silent as tombstones, until his truck disappeared completely from view. If this story resonates with you, hit that like button. It helps us keep sharing these moments of real justice and brotherhood. After Pritchard's truck disappeared down the road like a coward fleeing a battlefield, the tension in the air slowly dissolved like morning mist under the warming Montana sun. The wall of bikers relaxed almost imperceptibly, shoulders dropping, hands unclenching. The subtle shift from combat readiness to casual alertness that marked the difference between soldiers and civilians. Margaret walked down from the porch with careful, measured steps, her hand trailing along the wooden railing for support. She was wearing Tom's old Marine Corps sweatshirt over her nightgown, and her grey hair was still mussed from sleep, but there was a dignity in her bearing that reminded Jacob why Tom had loved her for 34 years. Her eyes were glistening with tears she was too proud to shed in front of strangers, but Jacob could see the relief radiating from her like heat from a campfire. For the first time in months, Margaret Sullivan looked like a woman who could breathe freely in her own home. She stopped in front of Jacob, her hands clasped tightly together to hide their trembling. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice breaking like a dam under pressure. "I don't know how to repay this." Jacob shook his head, his expression softening from warrior to brother. "You don't owe us thanks, ma'am. Tom would have done the same for any of us. Hell, he did do the same for many of us. This is just us returning the favor, keeping a promise we made a long time ago in a place far from here." Margaret looked past him at the sea of bikers, men with scars that told stories of foreign wars, tattoos that memorialized fallen friends, hard faces that had seen the worst humanity had to offer and somehow retained their capacity for justice. What she saw surprised her. Kindness. Beneath the leather and chrome and dangerous reputation, these were men who'd chosen to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. "Tom never told me about you," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the idle rumble of motorcycle engines. "About any of you. I didn't know he had brothers." "He wouldn't have," Jacob replied, understanding the weight of military secrets and the burden of protecting loved ones from ugly truths. Tom was the kind of man who carried his burdens alone, who thought he could shield you from the darkness by never talking about it. But he knew we had his back, just like he had ours, and now we have yours. One of the bikers stepped forward, the lean man with silver hair who'd introduced himself as Doc. His face was weathered by wind and sun and time, but his eyes were gentle, the eyes of someone who'd spent his life healing rather than harming. "Mrs. Sullivan," Doc said, removing his sunglasses in a gesture of respect. "I was Tom's medic in Fallujah. I pulled shrapnel out of his leg after a mortar attack in 2006. He carried me 2 miles to an extraction point when I got hit by sniper fire in 2007. We saved each other's lives more than once, which makes us family in the truest sense of the word." Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth, overwhelmed by the revelation that Tom's war experiences had included bonds she'd never imagined. "He talked about you," Doc continued. "Not often, because talking about home when you're in hell is sometimes too painful to bear. But when he did, his whole face would light up. He'd show us pictures, you at your wedding, you in your garden, you waiting for him at the airport when he came home on leave. He said you were his anchor, the reason he fought so hard to come home." Margaret's composure finally broke. She covered her face with her hands and sobbed, not from fear or sadness, but from a relief so profound it felt like drowning in reverse. For 8 months, she'd carried the weight of grief alone, convinced she was forgotten, abandoned, left to face the world's cruelties without protection. Now she understood that Tom's love had extended beyond the grave, that his brothers in arms had become her brothers too, that the code of honor they'd sworn to in foreign deserts was strong enough to reach across years and miles to shield her from harm. Jacob placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his touch careful and respectful. "You're not alone, ma'am. You never were and you never will be. If you ever need us again, day or night, rain or shine, no matter what you call. That's not a promise I'm making lightly. That's a covenant, sealed in blood and sacrifice, and the kind of loyalty that doesn't die when the war ends." Margaret looked up at him through her tears, seeing not a dangerous biker, but a guardian angel in leather and chrome. "What kind of men are you?" she whispered. "We're Marines, soldiers, sailors, and airmen." Jacob replied, "We're fathers and sons, husbands and brothers. We're the kind of men who believe that honor isn't just a word, it's a way of life. And we're the kind of men who never forget our promises, especially the ones we make to fallen brothers." Around them, the other bikers nodded in silent agreement, their faces reflecting the same unwavering commitment to a code that transcended civilian understanding. Later that afternoon, after most of the bikers had rolled out in groups of 10 and 15, heading back to their respective chapters across the mountain west, a core group of 10 remained behind. These were the inner circle, the men who'd served most closely with Tom, the ones who'd made the original promise in the desert heat of Iraq. Without being asked, without any discussion or coordination, they began to work. Hammer, whose real name was Marcus Webb and who'd been a combat engineer before becoming a motorcycle mechanic, noticed the loose board on Margaret's porch that creaked dangerously whenever she walked across it. He retrieved a cordless drill and a bag of screws from his bike's saddlebags and spent an hour reinforcing the entire structure, testing each board with his considerable weight until he was satisfied with the repairs. Doc and another biker called Priest worked together to replace the broken lock on Margaret's front door, the one that Pritchard had accidentally damaged during one of his increasingly aggressive inspections. The new deadbolt was military-grade, the kind used on secure installations, and came with keys that couldn't be duplicated without special authorization. Phoenix, a former Air Force mechanic whose weathered hands could coax life from any engine, diagnosed and repaired the issues with Margaret's ancient lawnmower, then proceeded to cut her grass with geometric precision that would have made a drill sergeant proud. The yard hadn't looked that good since Tom's death, and the improvement was dramatic enough to draw approving nods from neighbors. Steele and Ranger, both former Army infantry, repaired the sagging fence gate that had been hanging crooked for months, then reinforced the entire fence line with new posts and wire. They worked with the efficient coordination of men who'd built defensive positions under enemy fire, and their repairs would last for decades. Throughout the afternoon, Margaret tried repeatedly to pay them for their work, digging into her modest savings to offer compensation for materials and labor that would have cost her hundreds of dollars from professional contractors. They refused every offer. "This is what family does," Hammer said, wiping grease from his massive hands with a shop rag that had seen better days. "You don't charge family for taking care of them. That's not how it works in our world." "But I can't just accept all this help," Margaret protested, her voice thick with emotion and embarrassment. "It's too much. I don't deserve—" "Mrs. Sullivan," interrupted Priest, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who'd counseled dying soldiers and comforted grieving families. "Your husband died, saving the lives of 3 Marines he'd never met before. He didn't ask if they deserved to be saved. He didn't calculate the cost or weigh the risks. He just acted because that's what Marines do. They protect people, even at the cost of their own lives." Priest gestured toward the other men who'd stopped their work to listen. "Every man here owes Tom a debt that can never be fully repaid. He saved our lives, our sanity, our ability to come home to our own families. The least we can do is make sure his widow feels safe and cared for. This isn't charity, Mom. This is honor." As the sun dipped low over the Montana hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded Margaret of the sunset she used to watch with Tom from this same porch, Jacob sat on the steps beside her. The other men were packing up their tools, preparing for the long rides back to their respective homes and lives. "Tom talked about you," Jacob said quietly, his voice barely audible above the evening breeze. "Not often, because talking about home when you're in combat is sometimes too painful. But when he did, he always said you were the strongest person he knew." Margaret smiled sadly, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had grown cold in her lap. "I didn't feel very strong these past few months. I felt weak and afraid and completely helpless." "Strength isn't about not being afraid," Jacob said, echoing words he'd learned from a chaplain in Kandahar. "It's about doing what needs to be done, despite the fear. It's about asking for help when you need it, because that takes more courage than most people realize." Margaret looked at him with new understanding. "He never told me what you all went through over there, what you saw, what you did, what it cost you." Jacob was silent for a long moment, watching his brothers load their motorcycles with the practiced efficiency of men who'd moved equipment under fire. "We went through hell together. We saw things that no human being should ever have to see. We lost friends, lost pieces of ourselves, came back carrying scars that will never fully heal." He turned to face her, his pale eyes reflecting the fading light. "But we came back, not all of us, too many didn't, but enough. And the ones who made it out alive made a promise. No brother left behind, no family abandoned. Tom kept that promise until the day he died, and now it's our turn to keep it for him." Margaret reached over and squeezed Jacob's hand with surprising strength. "Thank you for everything, for being his brother when I couldn't be there, for coming when I called, for showing me that I'm not as alone as I thought." Jacob nodded, understanding that some bonds transcended words. He stood, pulled on his leather gloves, and walked toward his bike, where the others were already starting their engines in preparation for departure. One by one they rode off into the gathering dusk, their engines creating a symphony of steel and fire that echoed across the Montana landscape like a benediction. As they disappeared over the horizon in groups of 2 and 3, Margaret stood on her porch, her newly repaired, structurally sound porch, and watched until the last taillight faded from view. For the first time in 8 months, she felt like she could breathe again. For the first time since Tom's death, she felt protected, valued, cared for by people who understood the true meaning of loyalty and sacrifice. 3 weeks later, On a Tuesday morning, when the Montana sky was the color of faded denim and the air carried the promise of changing seasons, Margaret received a package in the mail. It was delivered by the regular postal carrier, a friendly woman named Carol, who'd been bringing mail to this route for 15 years and had known Tom well enough to nod respectfully whenever his name came up in conversation. The package was wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, old-fashioned in its simplicity, with Margaret's name and address written in careful block letters that suggested military training. There was no return address, but she knew instinctively who it was from. Inside, nested in layers of protective foam, was a framed photograph that made her gasp with recognition and wonder. It was the same picture Jacob had mentioned, the one from his garage, the one that captured 19 young men in desert camouflage uniforms, grinning at the camera with the invincible confidence of soldiers who believed they could conquer the world. Tom stood in the back row, fourth from the left, his arm draped over Jacob's shoulders in the casual way of brothers. He looked impossibly young, his face unmarked by the years of worry and responsibility that would come later. His smile was the same one he'd given her on their wedding day, full of love and hope and absolute certainty that everything would work out fine. Beneath the frame was a small brass plaque, precisely engraved with words that made her cry happy tears for the first time in months. "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." John 15. 13 Tom Sullivan, United States Marine Corps, served with honor, died with courage, remembered with love, no brother left behind, no family abandoned. Iron Covenant, MC. Margaret hung the photograph on her living room wall, right next to Tom's flag and medals, creating a shrine to sacrifice and brotherhood that would honor both her husband's memory and the men who'd chosen to protect her in his absence. She never heard from Dale Pritchard again. According to Linda Kowalski and the Neighborhood Gossip Network, he'd quietly sold all his rental properties within a month and moved out of state. Some said to Arizona, others claimed it was Nevada. No one knew for certain, and no one particularly cared. What mattered was that he was gone, and Margaret was safe. Margaret stayed in the house, her house now, free and clear, with a deed that bore her name alone and a mortgage that had been mysteriously paid in full by an anonymous benefactor who refused all attempts at identification or repayment. She planted roses in the front yard, the same hybrid tea roses that Tom had brought her every year on their anniversary. Deep red blooms that would flourish in the Montana soil and bloom every summer as a testament to enduring love. She started volunteering at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Billings, helping other military families navigate the complex bureaucracy of benefits and services. Her experience with grief, her understanding of loss, and her gentle manner made her invaluable to widows and families who were walking the same dark path she'd traveled. And once a month, on the second Saturday morning when the weather permitted, Jacob Stone and a rotating group of Iron Covenant members would roll up to her house, not to check on her because she no longer needed checking on, but to sit on her porch, drink her legendary coffee, and tell stories about Tom that she'd never heard before. Stories about the time he'd talked a suicidal soldier off a rooftop in Baghdad by promising to teach him to play guitar when they got home. Stories about how he'd shared his rations with Iraqi children who had nothing, even when supplies were running dangerously low. Stories about the night he'd carried a wounded enemy combatant 2 miles to a medical station because he believed that honor meant protecting all human life, not just American lives. Through these stories, Margaret discovered that her husband had been more than just the good man she'd married. He'd been a hero in ways she'd never imagined, a leader who'd inspired other men to be better than they thought possible, a Marine who'd embodied the Corps' values so completely that his influence continued long after his death. Margaret had lost her husband, the love of her life, her companion through 34 years of joys and sorrows, but she'd gained something unexpected and precious. A family bound not by blood, but by something stronger: honor, loyalty, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds forged in the crucible of war and tempered by the commitment to protect those who cannot protect themselves. The Iron Covenant had made a promise in the Iraqi desert: no brother left behind, no family abandoned. Tom Sullivan had kept that promise until his last breath, and now his brothers were keeping it for him, ensuring that his widow would never face the world's cruelties alone. On quiet evenings, when Margaret sat on her porch, watching the sun set over the Montana hills, she could almost feel Tom's presence beside her, his hand in hers, his voice whispering in the wind that carried the distant rumble of Harley-Davidson engines. The promise had been kept. The covenant endured. And love, it turned out, was stronger than death. Thank you so much for watching this story of honor, brotherhood, and the unbreakable bonds that connect those who serve. If this moved you, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting that notification bell so you never miss another story of courage, loyalty, and the power of keeping promises. These stories matter because they remind us that heroes walk among us every day, often wearing leather instead of uniforms, riding motorcycles instead of military vehicles, but carrying the same code of honor that makes them willing to stand up for those who cannot stand alone. We'll see you in the next one. Ride safe and remember, no brother left behind, no family abandoned.